We are now live with the webinar Countering Islamist Extremism, the Aftermath of the Attacks in Paris, Nice and Vienna.
Hi everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to our guest speakers for being with us today. It's a pleasure to welcome you. My name is Alina Bricman. I'm the Director of EU Affairs at Panelists International, a Jewish advocacy and service organization working globally to safeguard Jewish life, tackle anti-Semitism, and play our role in ensuring respect of universal values and generally the health of our societies. Our goal with these webinars is to bring you conversations that provide meaningful perspective on a wide range of topics relevant both to the Jewish community and other stakeholders. And it's certainly the case with our discussion today. After a chilling series of jihadist attacks in multiple European cities, we plan to take stock of the reality on the ground, discuss root causes, trends, and importantly, responses and long-term solutions around radicalization prevention and education. We also reflect on the particular impact that such attacks have on the Jewish community and the sense of safety and security of Jewish Europeans who are often explicit targets of Islamist extremism. We look both at the national level and in particular at France and Austria, and on the EU level with three outstanding experts on European jihadism, terrorism, and radicalization. And I will let my colleague, Ilan Selby, who will co-moderate our discussion today, introduce them to you.
Thank you, Alina, and welcome everyone also from my side. We're very pleased today to welcome, firstly, Laurence Bindner, who is the co-founder of the Jihadoscope project, an associate fellow with GNet, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, and she is also a member of the UN Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate Global Research Network. This year, she also served as an auditor in defence policy at the French Institute for Higher National Defence Studies. Dr. Daniela Pisoiu is a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. She specialises on terrorism, radicalisation, extremism, comparative regional security, American and European foreign and security policy. She completed her PhD at the University of St Andrews as part of the renowned CSTPV, the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. Daniela has also conducted fieldwork on the topic of radicalisation in Austria, Germany and France, as well as other European countries. And last but certainly not least, Guenther Sablattnig is advisor to the EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator. He previously worked in the Austrian Federal Ministry of Interior in various capacities, including as head of the Unit for Bilateral and Multilateral Affairs, as well as the Austrian Embassy in Islamabad and at Interpol Secretariat General. So welcome to all our guests, and with that being said, let's make a start. We'd like to start by looking at the national level to begin with. We were all shocked by the brutal beheading of Samuel Paty, a teacher in the suburbs of Paris who showed caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad to his pupils. Not long before that, we saw a series of attacks relating to the ongoing Charlie Hebdo trial, and not long after came the attack in Nice. This at a time when France was marking 5 years since the massacre at the Bataclan, the deadliest attack in France since World War II. Laurence, in coming to you first, I'd like you to speak to two broad areas if possible. First of all, as a citizen and as an individual, how were the recent attacks felt locally? And secondly, as an expert in the field, to what extent were they something to be anticipated based off of what is known about Islamist extremism networks locally? And if you could also take us through some of the cutting edge work that you're doing in understanding these trends as well.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Thank you, Alina. Thank you, Benebrit, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today with this panel of distinguished colleagues in this very, very timely session. Yes, so I'll talk about France, and I'll try to recontextualize the spiral of tensions that we have gone through since the beginning of September. And I'd like to discuss two elements. First, actually, these growing tensions do relate to a specific French context, at least was understood that way by some people. And they are actually the latest layer of a series of grievances against France, and have to be analyzed as the continuum of a historical perspective. But second, I think that we also should not consider France as an exception, and we should zoom out. The European Union is targeted, and we have to bear in mind that beyond the French model that is being criticized by jihadists and fundamentalists, they also violently target those who don't believe alike, both in the West and in Muslim countries. So first, few words on France. The growing tensions, as you said, Ilan, came in the wake of the republication of the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad by Charlie Hebdo for the opening of the trial of the January 2015 attacks in Paris. And the fact that Macron refused to condemn this publication was perceived as an approval, as an endorsement of the cartoons. And what was initially actually a private initiative by Charlie Hebdo turned out to be a diplomatic issue. And on the top of that, Macron gave a speech on separatism on the 2nd of October, which was misinterpreted as an additional aggression against Islam. So the recent cycle of violence, I mean, the three recent attacks, the first in front of the former Charlie Hebdo office, then the beheading of Samuel Paty, and then the attack in the Nice Basilique Notre Dame, erupted in a very particular context that is slightly different from the previous attacks that have been carried out in France. Here, the three assailants killed in the name, I mean, to avenge the prophet and in the name of faith. And they did not have formal links to jihadist organization, which of course raises the question of a more religious terrorism and more autonomous initiatives. So what I think is that among the numerous grievances that fundamentalists, jihadists, and radical Islamists bear against France, and apart from all the geopolitical grievances, the military presence of France in the former colonies, etc., I think that religion has a special place in these grievances, both in terms of laws, the laws that relate to a specific laïcité, we will expand on that later, and in terms of the very particular French expression of the freedom of speech. So regarding the laws, some laws have been considered by jihadists and radical Islamists as inherently hostile to Islam. And these laws are the laws that prohibit conspicuous religious symbols. There was a first law passed in 2004 that was concerning the school, and another law passed in 2010 concerning public places. And these laws have become a recurrent grievance against France because they are perceived like a measure against Islam, an expression of a certain state Islamophobia, and a sort of systemic, institutionalized racism. And of course, at the foundation of this law, there is the principle of French laïcité, which is a very specific secularism, and which is accused of, by some, of erasing Muslim identity. So, of course, this model has to be understood historically. Actually, the French Republic tried to build a nation by erasing conspicuous differences in the public space in order to create a homogeneous society, a unified society around values of universalism. This is, of course, very different from the Anglo-Saxon model, with nations that aggregate different communities and that that have a higher tolerance for particularism. So we see how Macron's speech on separatism refers to that, and refers to a corpus of civil laws concerning the public space that come at odds with religious law, knowing that, of course, Islam is a very legislative religion. And second things on religion, the French always have an irreverent stance regarding religion, with a particular anti-clerical press that is satirical and very disrespectful. And of course, this has also has to be seen as a specific legacy. It was used as a political weapon, an anti-religious weapon since the French Revolution, to accelerate the separation between church and state. And this also is a big contrast to the satirical press in the UK or in the US, which is usually more softer on religion. So, of course, all the recent events and the republication and Macron's speech have post-rationalized these grievances and have confirmed these grievances, and they, of course, fuel them even more. So the context here is very French-specific. But if we zoom out a bit, I think that France doesn't have to be seen as an island, and these events, of course, are fueling grievances against France, but not only, and also fuel grievances against its allies. I think that these events could, of course, give a new momentum to jihadist groups that have immediately tried to capitalize on that have endorsed the murder of Samuel Paty. They didn't claim it, but they endorsed it. And of course, they emphasized that they have always positioned themselves as the defender of an assaulted Islam. And of course, this momentum could generate violence against France, but could also impact Western countries as a collective punishment, because these players, jihadists in particular, see the world of disbelief as a unified world. Maybe we will dig more into that in a few minutes when we're going to talk about Austria, but with Daniela. But the assailant in Vienna, actually the very morning of his attack, sent to 2 of his contacts the video of the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attack, a few hours before attacking. So one could wonder if the republication could have influenced his attack, or maybe the timing of his attack. And to conclude, and regarding what you asked in the first place, Ilan, about how the attacks were felt locally, I think that this attack contributed to wider polarize the society, not only with a growing part of the extreme right, of course, it also fed their rhetorics, but also within the society, with numerous debates regarding our model and if we should update it, regarding the limits of freedom of speech, regarding the downsides of laicity. And this polarization was actually not between the French Muslims on the one side and the others on the other side. It was a multi-polarization with transpartisan debates. And these debates were, of course, further exacerbated by the reading of these events that the foreign press had on them. And I think that in this regard, France has to be ready to explain in cold blood, explain again, and here has a huge pedagogic task to undertake, to explain this model and how it's not actually an aggression toward anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence, for your overview there. It's certainly, you've touched on a few issues that, as you say, we'll go into more depth later on, including laïcité. And it's important as well, like you mentioned, to look at the specifics of the French example, but also see how that relates to broader issues on a wider European level, which brings us well onto our next question, which would be towards you, Daniela. In turning to Austria. Austria represents a different context, which until now could be seen as having somewhat of a shielded experience with Islamist terrorism, and please feel free to challenge this perception. At the start of the month, 4 people were killed and over 20 wounded at multiple crime scenes as a citywide manhunt ensued at the Vienna attack. The perpetrator was an ISIS jihadist who had been released from prison a year earlier. Daniela, same questions to you really for the Austrian context. How was the attack felt locally? What did it mean for the public, and to what extent was it something predictable or congruent with what is known locally vis-a-vis Islamist extremist networks or other lone wolf actors?
First of all, thank you as well for the invitation and for being able to be here with you. To the reaction, well, of course, it was a huge shock. Nobody really imagined anything like this could happen in Vienna. On the other hand, it was very heartwarming to see that there was a lot of solidarity and among the people on that night, because for a long time, it wasn't sure how many attackers there were, and people were told to go to their apartments, and some couldn't. So there were people saying, you can come to my apartment on Twitter, on Facebook. Many people volunteered to help out with the wounded. And there was also a couple of heroes who were actually having migration background and helped out with the wounded as well. It was very important, I think, for the city authorities and for us researchers as well to communicate that we are this cosmopolitan city, and then we like our social cohesion and our multicultural, heart, and we're not going to start blaming others and give into polarization. And that was really very important to establish. Actually, it's also interesting that among the victims, 2 were foreign. And one of them was actually of the same origin as the attacker. So you can see the irony and the sarcasm of this horrible thing, which is terrorism. Now, coming back to the sources of everything, and if we could have foreseen it, I think there were some signs. One relates to the particular case in question. So this individual actually tried to travel to Syria and was stopped on the way. He was put in prison. And we have said before as well that individuals who do not manage to go to Syria and homegrown terrorists can be actually more dangerous than the ones who did manage to go to Syria, because the returnees as such often come back and are very disappointed with what they have seen there, because the propaganda does not actually match the realities on the ground. So there was some talk about returnees, but not so much talk about these other homegrown individuals. Now, Austria did have a relatively high number of foreign fighters. So in Europe, it's number 2 pro capita, so proportional to population. But this has to be seen in a particular context because it involved individuals who in the majority went there because of the project of the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State or Daesh. So there were also people who went there because Russia was involved. So their motivation to go there wasn't that much because we hate Austria or because we hate democracy or whatever, but because they were fascinated by this project over there. And of course, there were also individuals who were fascinated by the violence too. And this is significant because in Austria, before this whole IS phenomenon, the jihadi scene was actually quite small. There were individuals who tried to make a life for themselves in this area, and they failed. They had to go to Germany to do that, right? But the project of the Islamic State was attractive for rather many people in various ways. Now, what happens is that the large majority of these people don't believe, of course, in this utopia anymore. But you have what I call a hardcore of individuals who still believe in this project, and especially the ones who didn't get the chance to actually go there and see it, can be actually quite dangerous. What I also have seen is that, and this is something that I guess is happening in general, of course, we don't have the Islamic State as such on the ground in Syria anymore. We have it, of course, spreading out in other parts of the world, but the original project is not there anymore. It's largely online. And this online sphere is growing and becoming very attractive to young people as well. So I think the danger is still there and should not be underestimated. Now, yeah, I mean, I suppose another particularity here is the fact that in Austria, the relationship with Islam as such has been actually quite good, actually very good. It's a different history. And in my experience, at least, in my interviews with foreign fighters and others, it wasn't about Austria as such, and it wasn't that much about religion either. For them, the IS project was attractive in different ways. I would even say subcultural ways, a youth subculture even. And this is becoming now even more attractive, I think. So the individual who carried out the attack, if we look at the way in which he was dressed and what he was saying, and then if we look also at what other people in his social environment are saying, it is something that is mutating and has the potential of becoming more attractive to more young people because it's becoming more European. And more attractive to people who are not necessarily so much into religion as such. Yeah, we're talking about people who have a catalog of rules, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and that's it. But I think I will stop there. Yeah, we can continue about other things later, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for the overview, and as well, Laurence. And I think both your interventions highlighted indeed some of the specificities, but also a lot of the common points. The online space being one, the question of lone actors versus being part of a wider network of extremism. Some of the differences around historical legacies versus something of a recent phenomenon, and so on. And perhaps Günther will be able to paint a more complete picture and tie these ends together. So I'm going to turn to you for a bit of the EU level perspective. First, perhaps we could begin with just understanding the responsibilities of your office overall, how it fits into the EU framework, and within the Counter-Terrorism office, how does tackling Islamist terrorism fit? And perhaps you could give us a bit of an overview of the current landscape and how it's evolved over the past, say, 5 to 10 years.
Of course, and good afternoon from my side. My name is Guenther Sablattnig. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this very interesting and timely webinar today. So I'm working at the office of the EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, Gilles de Kerkhoff. The office has been established, or the post of EU CTC had been established in 2004. And Gilles de Kerkhoff himself is in this function since 2007. We are working on policies related to counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism, and we cover both EU internal and external issues. And in this regard, we of course closely work with the European Commission and the External Action Service, the European Parliament, and many other stakeholders, EU agencies, but of course also NGOs, civil society organizations, international organizations, etc. About the CT landscape, I think what we have seen, and the two previous speakers, of course, addressed the issue already. We still see that jihadist terrorism is one of the great challenges in Europe and internationally. Although we see a lower number of attacks than between the period of 2014 until 2017, it remains a big threat. Daesh and Al-Qaeda are still there. They have not disappeared. And they are inspiring lone actors. And what Daniela just mentioned is also this online dimension. So I think this is something what we really need to consider and what we need to monitor carefully. Another important issue is, of course, foreign terrorist fighter returnees and those who have been prevented from going there, like the Austrian attacker. They come back in a very radicalized, and the challenge in Europe is to have the necessary evidence to basically prosecute them and to put them in prison. And very often this is a big challenge for FTF, but also for their family members, for accompanying women or children who might be highly radicalized, but because they are children, it's of course it will be very difficult to prosecute them, or impossible to prosecute them. In addition to these challenges on the jihadist side, we are of course facing many other terrorist threats in Europe right now, primarily also on the right-wing violent extremism side. Right-wing violent extremism has increased over the past years. We saw a shooting at a mosque near Oslo in August 2019. We saw the Halle attacks on a synagogue in Halle in October 2019. And there is also a change in the behavior of right-wing violent extremists, where 20 years ago, probably it was still the classic, let's say, neo-Nazi style type of person. The attackers or right-wing violent extremists are much more sophisticated today. They use codes, they use coded language, and of course, they increasingly interact internationally. So there are links between right-wing violent extremist groups worldwide, and it's also much more difficult to identify it as right-wing, because it's sometimes, I mean, it can be anti-Semitic, it can be anti-immigration, it can be homophobic or whatsoever. So you have these different types, and they are not necessarily related to each other. On the Islamist side, we see the Salafist ideology as a major driver of radicalization, as one of the drivers. This is, of course, a very sensitive topic, but we, the Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, has pushed this topic a lot over the past years. Because we just see, based on evidence, that it is a problem in Europe. It is dominating Islamic texts in Europe and beyond. And Salafist extremism is anti-Semitic, it's xenophobic, it's homophobic, and it's a problem for integration in Europe. They promote the us versus them, and they don't want Muslims to integrate in Europe, yeah? And this is, of course, also an interesting issue. One of the speakers before mentioned the term Islamophobia. This is, of course, it's something what is very often used also by Salafists to instrumentalize the discourse in Europe, and to basically push the discrimination Muslims face in Europe, which is legitimate, and it's there. I mean, it's a fact. Many Muslims are stigmatized or are discriminated, but to push this in one corner where it says basically there are so many people who are against your religion. Yeah? And what we very often forget is that there are also many Muslims in Europe which are moderate Muslims, yeah? And they are very often under pressure by exactly these Salafist groups. And this is, I think, quite an interesting aspect that we also need to consider, also in view of this discussion in France or around this French case right now. So what we try to promote is also a training of imams in Europe. I think this has also been on the agenda in France recently, that we somehow create knowledge and experience in Europe about Islamic theology, but beyond that also to train imams and to stop or to find ways how to stop foreign funding, particularly from the Gulf, or at least make it more transparent, so that we know who stands behind certain initiatives. From the European Union side, so we have there was a lot of activities ongoing over the past years. A major push was, of course, in 2015, the statement of the heads of state and government and the launch of the Security Union. This Security Union had now been updated, and there is a new Security Union strategy for 2020 until 2025 in place, which covers many different activities, both on the, let's say, hard security side, so on law enforcement cooperation, but also on soft measures, on prevention policies. On this hard security side, so to say, so on law enforcement cooperation and cooperation of security services, I would just like to say that I think we have really stepped up our efforts over the past, particularly 5 years. We see today a much better using and feeding of Europol databases by member states. The Schengen information system is much better used. And there is also a very well-functioning cooperation of the security services in Europe. The group is called CTG, the Counter-Terrorism Group. It is not part of the EU structures, but it's a multilateral format of all services of EU member states, plus Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And it works outside of the EU structures, but it is there and it is working. And then, of course, you have Europol and many other tools. And we, of course, also use and promote the Interpol channel for law enforcement cooperation, particularly when it comes to cooperation with EU third states where we don't have operational agreements with Europol, so where we are not able to share operational data between Europol and the respective third states. On the soft sides, on prevention, I would just like to briefly mention that we have done a lot on mainstreaming the idea of prevent activities, also in non-traditional policy areas, such as sports, culture, education, youth work, etc. DG EAC, so the Directorate General for Education and Culture, for example, is using the Erasmus Plus program and has set up a virtual Erasmus program to connect young people from the MENA region and the European Union. There are also role model initiatives where you have young people, individuals from certain neighborhoods that go back to their schools and universities and tell their story. And there are many other initiatives ongoing, both within EU member states and in third countries. And externally, we have engaged primarily in our direct neighborhood, so in the Western Balkans, in Turkey, and in the Middle East and North Africa region. And beyond that, there are projects through development cooperation and through other channels where we basically where we focus on specific aspects of counter-terrorism work or prevention work. So I think this is it from my side for the moment, and back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Günther. And actually, I would like to stay with you a little bit further because you already gave us a lot of the, let's say, building blocks of the discussion. The discussion is really multifaceted, and you spoke about the question of integration, migration, political will, this very hard security aspect of things, law enforcement cooperation, integrated security, and the work that's being done through the External Action Service. Perhaps you could just help us refine our understanding of these kind of various levels, how they fit in with each other. I'm thinking here of issues, again, of migration, peace and sustainable development, radicalization, prevention and education, as you mentioned, issues of fundamental rights, freedom of religion versus freedom of speech, and so on. How do these pieces fit in together within your work, and how do they, how does your office interact with other sides of EU policy in that sense? And perhaps you could exemplify for us some successful instances where you could track how these cooperations between different policy areas were successful.
Of course. Well, we are, as I've mentioned, we are working on policy, so we are not operational. But of course, we closely work together with the different directorate generals within the European Commission, with the External Action Service and the EU delegation, and many other players. Yeah. So on the prevention side, the European Commission has undertaken many efforts in over the past years. There is a steering board on radicalization that is led by the Commission, and that includes the member states. The Counter-Terrorism coordinator also regularly attends these meetings. There is also a network of prevent policymakers, and all these different formats have the aim to basically share information, share good practices, discuss cases, and discuss how we can further promote certain approaches in areas such as de-radicalization inside and outside of prison, or a right-wing violent extremism, or Islamist ideology. In addition, there are also there is the RUN, the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is a huge program funded by the European Commission. It is actually a new phase of this program has just started beginning of this year with 2 parts. One part is already operational. It's basically the old RUN model, the old Radicalization Awareness Network that had already existed in the past, which includes working groups on specific topics: youth, education, police, prisons, where experts meet and share their experiences. And the second part of this current phase of RUN will start beginning of next year, and it will include more this component targeted towards the member states, so to directly assist member states. But as far as I understand it, so far it will also include strategic communications elements. We had a very successful project in the past that was called European Strategic Communications Network, ESCN. And the idea is to include this former project into the new RUN. So, and these are areas where we concretely work. When it comes to online information, so to cooperation with internet service providers, to hate speech online, disinformation, or also terrorist content online, the Commission has set up the so-called EU Internet Forum, where we closely work together with the major internet companies and discuss exactly these issues. And what will be probably even more important in the future is also to link this better up, to better coordinate these different work streams. Because so far, the EU Internet Forum primarily deals with terrorist content online. There is a separate code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. And there's also a code of practice on disinformation. So I think in the future, we really need to aim at better coordinating these different formats, and also having probably a clearer discussion with the companies what we expect, what they can deliver, and how we can actually achieve this. Because very often, I think it's also, I mean, first of all, of course, you need to agree on a terminology, which is already a huge challenge. But then you also need to find ways to practically implement these measures. And of course, you can work a lot with automation or to automatically detect re-uploads. But what if something is new? And I mean, you need to have the right experts in place who are able to identify this content. This might be, in a way, easy if you have clear cases, if you have a beheading video, let's say. Yeah? But if it comes to a long pamphlet written by somebody who, and this pamphlet might be anti-Semitic or not, and then you need somebody to basically identify this and say, well, this is only bad taste, or this is anti-Semitic, or this is hate speech, or whatsoever. So I think these are very practical issues that we need to discuss also with these companies, because it cannot be that they just then delete or take down everything. So I think there we also need to keep this balance between freedom of speech on one side and what is hate speech, or what is clearly an anti-Semitic propaganda.
Thank you very much, Günther, and you've spoken to a lot of different issues there, including an overview to the makeup of the instruments and tools that EU level has on counter-terrorism, as well as you say there, the need to look at hate speech online, which is something that Bindner is really heavily involved with at an EU level. Now, if we can, let's try and transpose this input back into a national context, and coming to Daniela and Laurence. On the national level, politics and public opinion plays an elevated role. There have been many developments on a policy level in the past years, yet these are often uprooted in the wake of attacks because there is a political need for change, for a new approach to be touted. And Daniela, perhaps I could come to you first before moving to Laurence. Could you speak to how public debate has shaped and influenced policymaking in the wake of these attacks, and to what extent this has been constructive or otherwise?
It has been a very controversial debate with various kinds of ideas. I think what is really important to emphasize, and since we heard about the Radicalization Awareness Network, there are really very many best practices at the European level. So we know a lot now how to prevent terrorism, and especially relevant for our case, how to de-radicalize individuals. Now, unfortunately, most of these practices are not actually implemented at the national level. And this has many reasons. Often it has to do with the language, because as we call them, frontline workers don't necessarily always speak English, for example, don't know where to find these texts. But to come back to the case in point, so the issue that was really happening in Austria is that we don't really have a de-radicalization program as it should be at the European standard nowadays, which means that you have to have a multi-agency structure, multidisciplinary approach. You have to have several institutions who participate, and you have to really take the individual, because he was in prison, right? So to take the individual from day one and guide him through prison, through probation, and then outside to reintegrate, to go back to being, regular in the sense of dealing with, regular social networks, having a job. So basically going away from that small, isolated universe, which is the radicalization bubble. There are very many good tips and tricks how to do this, but this was not implemented here. And I suspect it's also the case in other countries. Now, the practitioners know this, and there have been attempts and also participations in EU projects on prevention, on de-radicalization. But the bottom line is that you need a political commitment to this. Like, you need to have somebody in government saying that, this is important for us. We're going to invest in this. We're going to make sure we have the right professionals in the right structures doing this very important work, because it is very important. Now, unfortunately, after this attack, the reaction was not this. The reaction at the political level was rather more repression. So the kinds of measures that were proposed were putting people in prison for life, treating them like individuals with mental issues. There was basically little, if any, emphasis on the area of prevention and de-radicalization. So researchers and civil society feels completely let down, first of all, because their work has been completely ignored, and second of all, because there is no support, even if we know how important and relevant now this thing is. I mean, for a long time in Austria, the mantra was to say, well, nothing is going to happen to us. We are not that important, right? I mean, we are not participating in any wars. We are neutral. The last attack was here 30 years ago, and it didn't really have to do with Austria at all at that point in time either. So there was, in the past, very little emphasis on this issue. And now I have to note and communicate that this little emphasis on the issue continues. Terrorism is a big topic now, of course. There's also talk about ideologies, but I think that the approach is not the right one. And just a short note on ideologies, what I'm missing is really the focus on what matters. So I totally agree, Salafism is something that we have to look at, jihadism, of course, as well, and terrorism. Unfortunately, these really specific focused discourses are quite rare in the public debate. There are, of course, specialists who point this out, but in the debate is something more along the lines of Islam-related ideologies in general, which are to a certain extent stigmatized, and with them Muslims. And this, I think, is very, very dangerous, not in terms of counter-terrorism only, but also in terms of social cohesion and preventing polarization. As I mentioned before, Austria has a huge advantage of having this very relaxed, actually, relationship with Islam, and this can actually be jeopardized by political discourses which are basically stigmatizing an entire population. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Daniela. And Laurence, same question to you, really, if you could speak about the public debate that is shaped and what influences there have been on policy making in a national context.
Yeah, well, there are several issues. First, that there is indeed a strong debate that is now exacerbated regarding the latest event surrounding freedom of speech that is linked to laïcité, but actually the two issues don't totally overlap. Regarding freedom of speech, on the one side, in France, you have the advocates of the freedom of speech without the limits of this type of cartoons. They say that one should have the right to publish cartoons and to blasphemy as long as it's not an incitement to violence. And on the other side, you have those who want to appease the debate in adapting this freedom of speech to a new paradigm, to a new environment where believers and disbelievers are more interconnected, and with the concern of not triggering more violence, more grievances, and more polarization within the country and on a global scale. And now the supporters of the first category, the one that are in favor of the republication, argue that if one gives in and renounces to publish the caricatures for fear of retaliation, it means that one is surrendering to intimidation and to self-censorship. And I think that also in that side, many people that support the republication don't think that these cartoons are funny, but rather they might think that they are vulgar, they are humiliating, they are offending, but they just reject the idea of self-censorship for fear of retaliation and maintain that we have to stick to the value of press freedom without compromise, and that the publication of this caricature is sort of safeguard to other types of value. This attitude is very well synthesized in a quote summarizing Voltaire's position. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And I think that until now, I would say that a large majority of French people was sharing that position. But now the gap between the two sides has widened in the recent weeks, in the recent months since September. And now regarding the laïcité, it's something slightly different. It's something that is misunderstood abroad, in particular in the Anglo-Saxon world. It might be seen by the conservatives as a sort of dogmatic stance towards religion, and by the more liberals as a sort of tool of potential oppression against minorities. And so it has to be understood in a historical perspective. It took centuries to be implemented, but there are an increasing number of voices that currently question the model. And I think that there are several important characteristics in French laïcité. First, it refers to the idea that we cannot govern a state with divine laws. It's a separation between religion and laws, which says that it's not religion that can fix what is good and what is evil. And it's the French laïcisation, the French process of laïcité, that ended the domination and the influence of clericalism in French politics. And so one should bear in mind how violent it was against Christianity. But actually, the idea was to protect the state from the influence of clericalism. And some supporters of the laïcité, like Clemenceau or Aristide Briand, had, of course, nothing against religion and nothing against Catholics. They just wanted the influence of the church on the political power to stop. So in France, you will, for instance, never see a politician swear on a Bible or refer to religious references, because he would be mocked by many people. So I think that this is an important point. Laïcité is not against religion. It's to protect the state and the society against, first, too strong an influence, or second, against the influence of fundamentalist groups that want to impose their views, especially to their fellow believers. So this laïcité is also protection against the interference of fundamentalism within a community. And so the underlying idea, once again, is that regarding the cohesion and the coherence of the nation and the social body, the civil link is stronger than the religious link. So this statement actually is starting to be debated with a growing influence of identitarians that are, of course, influenced by the Anglo-Saxon model that is pervasive in the cultural space, for instance. And this multiculturalist model, which, of course, is probably more adapted to the Anglo-Saxon culture, and which also has its downsides. Like, for instance, there was a recent poll showing that actually the French people were more acceptant toward Muslim than many other countries in Europe, and that they would accept more than Muslim marry their children than other countries in Europe. So I think that this clearly outlines the fact that this laïcité is not a tool of oppression towards a religion or a minority. And also regarding Islam, a lot of religious Islamic authorities and a huge majority of Muslims do support the integration and the insertion of a peaceful Islam within this model of laïcité. Even if others fear that this model will delete their identity. And of course, all the challenge in the future will be to convince that laïcité will not eradicate their religious identity. Yeah, I'll stop for that.
No, thank you so much to both of you and Laurence on this question of laïcité. As you say, indeed, I think it's very hard for folks outside of France to truly grasp its meaning. And I say that even simply observing the Jewish community, which in France is one of the more observant Jewish communities, more religious Jewish communities in Europe, how committed they are themselves to the concept of laïcité, which may seem quite contradictory, but certainly very much fits into this description of French laïcité that you spoke of. Günther, let me return to you. Kind of connecting with this point that Daniela made about how much of the positive developments on a EU level maybe have not fully penetrated the national level. When we speak of concrete prevention strategies, radicalization prevention, and so on, where does the responsibility lie? Who should we be looking to? Are national governments doing enough to translate things from the EU level? To what extent should other actors be involved? We spoke of social media platforms. Perhaps civil society. Where does civil society's role lie there? How would you connect these levels of responsibility, and how can more from the EU level trickle down?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question, and it's of course a bit tricky to answer. But I think what is important to say in this regard is, of course, the European Union, the Commission side, the EU level is strong when it comes to connecting the member states, connecting experts, and also funding initiatives, funding policy development, funding new programs, new ideas, enabling experts to meet and things like this. Yeah? The concrete work needs to be done, of course, on national and on local level. And what I've also mentioned before, I mean, there are several instruments, primarily also the Radicalization Awareness Network that is in place, that is exactly doing this, and that supports member states, that provides train-the-trainers activities, etc. But of course, it's always up to the member states to take this up and implement it. And there, I think a lot has happened in the past. It depends, of course, a lot among the member states, because you have some member states that are much more concerned about these things than others, where the threat is basically lower. And so there you see more and less engagement of individual member states on EU level. And what you've mentioned, I think, is a very important element also, that it's also not important to leave this on a national level. So it really needs to trickle down, and we need to reach local administrations and grassroots organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations. There, again, we also have to be careful, because it wouldn't be the first time that you then employ civil society organizations or provide them with some funding, and then after some time you realize that this is actually an organization that has links to the Muslim Brotherhood, or that has links to some Salafist organizations. Yeah? So I think there vetting is very important, also to just to know who you work with. Yeah, that's it. This is a bit, and of course, what I've just mentioned before on cooperation with internet service providers, again, very important. And these are things, again, this is something where we really can deliver on EU level, because there it's better to be united and to do this collectively, the 27 member states and the Commission together with the internet service providers.
Thank you, Günther. And perhaps a final question to all of you. We've spoken of Islamist extremism as an ideology, and indeed, I think that that's important to state, a dangerous ideology that invariably also has an anti-Semitic component to it. Many of the attacks in the past years were anti-Semitic in nature. Many have targeted various Jewish institutions, schools, museums, community centers. Jewish communities and individual Jewish Europeans feel often particularly at risk, and we live with this heightened sense of alert. So how, if at all, are you specifically addressing this component in your work, and perhaps how do you see it being addressed more broadly around you? I'm going to start perhaps with Daniela, then go to Laurence, and close with the European level.
So just in general, I think there's a high sensitivity here for this issue, also for historical reasons. I can confirm from our own research in the Institute that, of course, the jihadi propaganda does have this very strong anti-Semitic element. It also popped up during the pandemic. So all those conspiracy theories were rolled out again, how, you know, the Jews are behind everything. And this was, of course, very similar to the right-wing extremist forums. So you often had the same kind of conspiracy theory, you know, in this area. What we also found in our research, working with communities, because just to give you some background, we think that it's important to involve communities in prevention work, and I mean all communities, not just migrants, but really everybody. And in our field research, we also talked to Jewish communities, and they said that they feel increasingly insecure in their own, you know, in their own parts of town, and their main concern was right-wing extremism, and especially the new, well, not so new anymore, form of identitarians. And here I want to make a point that for contemporary right-wing actors, it's not always clear that they are anti-Semitic. So many of them act and talk in a very strategic manner. They even claim to be on the side of Israel on things, but actually, if you look behind the curtain, then you can see, of course, that the ideology has remained the same with this very strong anti-Semitic element. So I think this is something that we need to look at more carefully, and again, involving all communities in our prevention work has actually a lot of benefits, not just in this respect, but also contributing to social cohesion and showing that it doesn't really matter what kind of religion you have. What matters is where you live and to be good with each other. I mean, I know it sounds perhaps funny, but this is something that also the city of Vienna is trying to do with this, you know, living together concept. And yeah, I think really it's the way to go.
Thank you, Daniela, and I take your point, and also Günther point earlier on growing right-wing extremism, and it's certainly a big concern for the Jewish community everywhere. But yeah, I think it's always important to see how a lot of the patterns of action are really common between these various forms of hate, and particularly within the online space. I think that's the most visible. Laurence, coming to you.
Yes, well, yeah, well, French Jews have been indeed hardly targeted in the recent past. The most striking of these attacks were the 2012 attack against the Ozara Torah school in Toulouse, where one teacher was killed, along with 3 children that have been killed point blank. There was also the hypercacher attack in 2015, and one can also mention the attack of the Jewish Museum in Brussels, since the assailant was actually French. And yes, the Jews are actually among the most targeted. The assailant of the Toulouse shooting, Mohamed Merah, was linked to ACAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula, and the assailant of the hypercacher was linked to ISIS, so a wide spectrum of the jihadist world. Yeah, my work consists of analyzing extremist speech online, and so So yes, of course, we come across recurrent anti-Semitic rhetorics in jihadist sphere, in radical Islamist sphere, of course. And I would say that radical Islamist anti-Semitism is fed by several components. A religious component, for those, of course, who have a very literal reading, literal interpretation of the Quran, of some parts of the Quran. A historical grievance with the creation of Israel, the military defeat of 1967, and the humiliation that was felt in the Muslim world, in the Arab world. One could also name the influence of the old European anti-Semitism, and as Daniela mentioned, the conspiracy theories associated to the Jews, that also feeds that. And also, we have social grievances with the perception that Jews are more wealthy or closer to the circles of power, and the sense that this is orchestrated against other communities. And so there is regularly a sense of double standards, a two-tier justice where one category is favored and another one is the victim. And so, well, in France, of course, this issue is taken very seriously by the government, which is working to tackle these misinterpretation, this bias with various organizations, the DILCRA within the government, but also anti-racist organizations, a lot of them, also Jewish organizations that are, some of them are very active in promoting the values of the Republic. I'm thinking, for instance, of the American Jewish Committee in Paris, which actively promotes these values, but also alerts on anti-Semitic bias, and also fights other types of racism, for instance, in being vocal regarding the fate of the Uyghur population. And of course, I mean, on the online space in particular, but not only, this fight is a guerrilla, and it has to be fought on a daily basis, over and over, tirelessly, and on multiple fronts. And as also Günther mentioned, I think that one should not forget, and one should bear in mind that one part of the extreme right remains strongly anti-Semitic, and this has not disappeared and could also be lethal. I'm thinking of a recent event in France. There was a white supremacist individual that was arrested in May, and he was arrested on suspicion of preparing an attack against a synagogue. So this threat is also very acute on several sides.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Laurence. And yes, passing on to Günther.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think what is really important is to look at all three sides of anti-Semitism. And one major one, but not the only one, is Islamist anti-Semitism. Then, of course, you have right-wing anti-Semitism and also left-wing anti-Semitism. And it really depends a bit on each individual country, where certain forms are stronger or not so strong. What I've also seen recently is that when it comes to anti-Semitic incidents online, that this would rather happen in the right-wing scene. And when it comes to physical violence, that this is then more on the Islamist side. But nevertheless, I mean, both are issues we need to tackle, and I think we just need to be very vigilant in all directions. The European Council has adopted a declaration in 2018 on anti-Semitism and the fight against anti-Semitism in all its forms. There's also a commission working group since then established that is working on the fight against anti-Semitism, and the working group has met several times in 2019 and 20 so far, and has discussed different topics, including security. And right now, there is an EU action plan being developed by the European Commission, and I hope that it will be finalized next year on issues related to anti-Semitism, from security aspects to integration, to Holocaust education, etc. So that's a bit the European dimension on this. I think generally what is needed on national, and again, here the EU can basically propose actions, they can fund certain initiatives, but it's the member states who need to deliver. And if it's about providing the security for Jews in their communities, it's also the member states who need to pay for it. It's very often it's a question of money and of resources. What we have also seen in the past is that it's very good if there is a joint risk assessment between the law enforcement services and the Jewish communities, so that they can jointly assess the threat, that the communities are also taken serious because they might see certain things that the police doesn't see, also because they might hear certain things that the police doesn't hear. Because if a Jew walks somewhere in a street and gets harassed, he might not immediately call the police, but he might tell somebody from his community. So I think these are issues, and related to that, of course, we need to we need to do much more awareness raising on both sides. First, on the side of the police to take these cases serious, but then also on the side of the Jewish communities to tell their people, well, if you have something to report, please report it. Yeah? It's not just a small incident and this can happen and it's nothing. No, it is something, and please report it, because otherwise we don't have numbers, we don't have statistics. It's always, we made this exercise about a year and a half ago, where we have asked the Jewish communities, could you tell us about numbers? What's the number of cases? Yeah, and if you then look at it, the numbers are sometimes very low. Yeah, but this is primarily because people don't report it, because they say, oh, this was just somebody harassing me on the street, so I don't report it. I think this is really something where we need to raise much more awareness, that people report it, but then also that the police takes this serious, that the police reports it internally, and that there is a proper statistics that is ideally also comparable on EU level, so that we can really see what is the scope of the problem and where do we need to adjust, and where can we also support the individual member states. Thank you.
If I could add something, I don't know if we still have time. Because you mentioned incidents, we actually have the information in Austria that the incidents against Jews have dramatically increased recently. So it's not just something of this year or last year, but you can see really an upward curve in this area. The other thing is that talking about education, there is a tradition in Austria and Germany as well at school to go and visit, Holocaust sites, concentration camps, and this is still being done. But because people nowadays don't have the experience of that, story anymore, it's still kind of difficult to convey the dimension of the catastrophe. So we've noticed that in the area of education, it's important to still try to explain and show people what has actually happened, because especially in the right-wing extremist area, you have people who, of course, try to relativize the whole thing and invoke conspiracy theories and things like this, or even invoke the freedom of speech. So this is something that is not really dealt with enough. And in one of our projects, we developed a game to explain how people radicalized, and we actually included a discussion on this topic because I think it's still relevant to talk about it, and because it's something that actually has happened and not just a story.
Thank you to both of you, and I think maybe one thing to note on top of the things that Günther mentioned, that I think relates to what you said, Daniela, about integrating these various aspects that are relevant to radicalization prevention, is the hopefully upcoming Council declaration spearheaded by the German presidency around making anti-Semitism a cross-cutting issue and seeing it reflected across policy areas. I believe it will be an important aspect also in dealing with counter-terrorism work. So I think that's a much welcome development, and I'm hoping that it will come through. All right, this said, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So allow me to thank you all so much for your thoughts and expertise that you've shared with us today. Dr. Daniela Pisoiu, Laurence Bindner, and Guenther Sablattnig. You helped us be reminded of the very real and present danger, but also of the fact that there are short and long-term solutions being put forward to build resilience. You are doing really crucial work in safeguarding basic values of freedom and diversity and pluralism in Europe. So we're incredibly grateful for that. Thank you for being with us today, and thank you to everyone watching. Stay safe, and we look forward to see you on our next B'nai B'rith International program.